All right, good morning, guys. This is a day late, but I'm just going to go through some of the civil rights issues that you need to know about. This is not going to be very exciting as I am just trying to get through the grading and things like that. So, when it comes to civil rights, again, this is all part of the 14th Amendment, and the particular part of the 14th Amendment that goes with civil rights is the Equal Protection Clause. So, people should not be discriminated against, and it's actually the job of the government to step in when discrimination is occurring or people are not being treated equally before the law. So, when it comes to what types of discrimination you need to know for the test, it's going to be racial discrimination, gender, and then age, disability, sexual orientation will also factor in. So, even though the 14th Amendment passed after the Civil War and it was stated that it's the job of the government to step in and ensure that people are treated equally before the law, it's taken a long time for the federal government to actually start to play that role. So I'm going to skip just ahead here a little bit. So, just a reminder about some of the ways that African Americans continued to be discriminated against after the Civil War. We had the Jim Crow laws that basically allowed for or created segregation in public places and places like schools. And in this case, initially, this is an important case to know right down here, the Supreme Court did say in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal is constitutional. So this is what established the separate but equal doctrine that lasted for a long time. Now, that was not overturned until Brown versus Board of Education, and that was in 1954. Basically, the court said in this case, it overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and it said that no, separate but equal facilities are inherently unequal because the mere act of separating people because of the color of their skin is implying that one group is inferior to another group. And it kind of creates an institution of segregation and inequality. So that case is going to be incredibly important because even though the government the Supreme Court issues this decision, it's one thing for them to make the decision. It's another thing for it to actually get enforced by the states and the federal government. And so in the years after Brown, many school districts did not actually integrate. Which led to things like the Little Rock Nine when Eisenhower had to send in, troops to protect Black students that were trying to be integrated into a school. So eventually, it's going to take the Civil Rights Act to actually get Brown versus Board of Education enforced. So keep in mind that there are two types of segregation. De jure segregation is what we're dealing with here with the Jim Crow laws. It's segregation by law. And so that is fixable by creating laws or that undo that, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What we're still dealing with today is de facto segregation, which is segregation that just occurs because of economic circumstances or personal choice. And, we don't say that communities have to be segregated, they just are. And how do we fix that? It's much more difficult. So first, let's take a look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it's really important to note that this ended segregation in not just like public government places, but any places that serve the public interest. So that means hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, all of those also had to be regulated by the government. So in this case, the government did come in and tell private businesses that serve the public interest that they cannot discriminate. And they used the Interstate Commerce Clause to make that case. It also said there cannot be discrimination in employment. So that law was incredibly essential in ending some of that de jure segregation. All right, the other area in which African Americans were discriminated against after the Civil War is with voting. So the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. But after Reconstruction ended, they were largely denied that right to vote. That is because of things called a poll tax, where you had to pay to vote, and African Americans did not have the money. Literacy test. Many African Americans and poor whites across the South did not know how to read or write. And the schooling across the South, there had been no public schools prior to the Civil War. So this is going to make it very difficult for African Americans to vote. And remember, the poor whites who may not have money or may not be able to read and write, they were exempted from these voting requirements by the grandfather clause. In addition to that, we already talked about, back when we talked about Congress, the court case Shaw versus Reno. So that is when districts are mostly drawn funny by the states in order to ensure a certain political party wins. During this time, it was more racial gerrymandering. So the districts were drawn funny in order to make sure there was always a white majority, and therefore limit African Americans' power at the polls if they did vote. All right, so some of the solutions that you need to know would be, first of all, the 24th Amendment, which got rid of all poll taxes and said you cannot force people to pay to vote. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So basically, this eliminated literacy tests. It gave the federal government the power to go into states or counties that had been violating voting rights the most and oversee the registration process as well as the voting process to be sure that things were being implemented fairly. Okay, and then the last possible solution I want to talk to you about. This came about more in the late 1960s and 1970s, and this was a way to try to deal with more of that de facto segregation. The fact that African Americans across the country, because of de facto segregation, may have been going to poorly funded public schools and not being given the same opportunities to get into college. So affirmative action is when a school or government or even a private business puts in place policies that allow them to consider race, sex, economic class, and things like that when deciding who they will accept or hire. It was decided in a landmark case called California versus Bakke that basically predetermined quotas were not okay. So it's not okay for a school to say we are going to make sure we accept 20% of our acceptance, it goes to African Americans. However, schools and universities are allowed to consider race as well as religion and economic class and sex when deciding who to admit. And the argument there is that it creates a diverse learning environment.